Hi, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have placed the hands of the Doomsday Clock closer to midnight than at any other time since nuclear weapons were invented. They reckon that the risk of a nuclear catastrophe through miscalculation or madness is greater than ever before. Yet our preoccupation with COVID and climate change have pushed all things nuclear largely out of our radar. Not though for analysts and activists like John LaForge, who's written extensively on the subject. He's co-director of Nukewatch, a peace and environmental justice group in Wisconsin in the US. John, welcome to the Political Compass podcasts.
Thank you very much.
You've been a nuke watcher for a long time and very intensively. Do you agree with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that we're in particularly dangerous territory these days?
Yes, I think they're quite right about that. With all the modernization of nuclear weapons that is going on, it involves the miniaturization of these devices and increasing likelihood that certain madmen would consider them usable in a shooting war. So all the escalation of hostility among nuclear-powered countries does raise a lot of concern.
Well, I'm thinking of India, a nuclear-armed country, with saber rattling going on at one point of its borders with China and the other with Pakistan, both of them also nuclear weapon equipped. It does certainly raise concerns. How many countries now have a nuclear weapon capacity?
I believe there are 9 countries now that have nuclear arsenals. The great majority of them are in Russia and the United States, several thousand apiece. The other states have several hundred. Interestingly, a few of the countries don't admit it. Israel is one of those that refuses to acknowledge the open secret that it has between 100 and 400 nuclear warheads. There's so much attention paid to the civilian nuclear program in Iran that it seems almost common knowledge to people, even though it's completely mistaken, that Iran has a nuclear weapon, but it hasn't got any.
This is a kind of blanket approach on the side of the West and selectively condemning nuclear capacities.
The hypocrisy of West position on Iran is kind of laughable too, because at the same time that the U.S. government and the nuclear industry promotes the development of new nuclear reactors, they point the finger at Iran and insist that Iran doesn't have any right to develop nuclear reactors. Of course, Iran is a signatory party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and has promised not to develop nuclear weapons as such. On the other hand, India and Israel refused to sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the U.S. turns a blind eye to that, even while President Biden is openly condemning authoritarian states. It has nothing to say about India's nuclear weapons program or its authoritarian current government, or the Philippines or other U.S. allied countries.
Yeah, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is in force, and it's supposed to ban any development or possession or threatened use of nuclear weapons. Is that effective, or are they words?
Well, it's a little of both. It's been effective for the nuclear weapon states because it gave them a sort of legal cover in their possession and threatened use of nuclear weapons, and it's been somewhat effective in allowing certain other states to develop nuclear power reactors as long as they promise to not develop nuclear weapons. On the other hand, Article 6 in which all the signatory parties promised to proceed to the disarmament of the nuclear arsenals at an early time, as the treaty says, has been a complete failure, and it's been ignored since 1970 by the treaty signatories. There's another problem with enforcement in that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the first two articles prevent and prohibit nuclear weapon states from placing their nuclear weapons in other countries. And yet the United States has its nuclear weapons, the B-61s, as they're called, deployed in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey right now, and have since the 50s, in open violation of the first two articles. Article 1 says you won't put nuclear weapons in other countries. Article 2 says you won't receive nuclear weapons from other countries. So the NATO partners that allow U.S. deployment of these B-61s, they are also in violation of the treaty. So it does have its weaknesses as well in terms of being able to be enforced against violators.
Is the U.S. alone in placing its nuclear weapons abroad?
Yes, we are. You could say we're number one. We're the only country in the world that places nuclear weapons in other countries. And it's a little more nefarious because, for example, in Germany, there's Bushel Air Base in the southwest part of the country. It's a German base, and the German pilots there fly their German PA-200 Tornado jet fighters, but it's the 702nd Munitions Support Squadron of the U.S. Air Force that maintains and polishes the 20 B-61 hydrogen bombs that are deployed there. And they are ready and practice on a regular basis handing these nuclear weapons up to the Tornado jet fighters, where their pilots practice using them. They use dummy weapons for practice runs, but they practice and have routinized, you might say, attacking Russia with these U.S. nuclear weapons in blatant violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
That's
and the same goes on in the Netherlands and Belgium and Italy.
That's interesting because the Germans are quite squeamish about nuclear weapons and nuclear power even. Is there any indication that they're becoming uncomfortable with this arrangement?
Oh, absolutely. You're quite right that the German public is seriously opposed to the deployment and retention of this, this little remnant of the Cold War arsenal. At one point in the 60s, there were 7,000 U.S. nuclear weapons in Germany, but after the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, the population said, we want these out, and almost all of them have been removed. These remaining 20 are just a hilarious, sort of bizarre remnant that is just a status symbol of some kind. And the public is such a great majority of the public is opposed to this, that in 2010, there was a unanimous cross-party vote in the Bundestag, the German parliament, to urging the government to negotiate the removal of these remaining nuclear weapons. So that was 11 years ago. It still hasn't taken place. The government there is obviously under heavy pressure from the U.S. administrations and the other NATO allies to maintain this charade. In fact, they're planning, and this is again what the German public is trying to prevent, they're planning a replacement of the current B-61 versions there. They're the B-61-3s and the B-61-4s. But the U.S. is spending between $10 and $12 billion to build 400 to 600 brand new B-61 version 12s, and to replace all these 100 Eurobombs with the new version. And so the German peace movement right now, Nukewatch, our office, has been quite involved with the campaign over the last 10 years. They have been advocating three principal demands. One is that the current B-61s be removed. Secondly, that the current bombs not be replaced with the B-61-12. And thirdly, that Germany break out of the U.S. orbit there and finally sign on to the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which came into effect January of this year.
That's going to upset their engagement with NATO, no doubt.
Absolutely, but we're hoping that one of these 5 NATO nuclear sharing partners does break out of the orbit there, just with regard to nuclear weapons anyway, lead the way, and then the other 4 would probably follow suit.
Getting back to the 70s and 80s, John, it's incredible that nuclear weapons and all things nuclear, even after Fukushima, have been more or less off the international radar. Of course, big preoccupations with COVID and with climate change. But going back to the 80s, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War was a large organization of concerned medical professionals. And there were mass demonstrations. Now, IPPNW is only a small body compared to what it was then. And, you know, the likes of campaigns for nuclear disarmament have all but vanished. What's going on? How's the public been able to turn its back on these concerns?
Well, there's so many reasons. Part of the reason was end of the Cold War, and a couple of, we call them numbers treaties, between the nuclear armed states, or between Russia and the U.S. at least, reduced the total number of deployed nuclear weapons. These things sort of gave the impression to the public that the threat of nuclear war shrank, if not vanished altogether. And other things that take priority are the climate crisis, that is more evident in terms of practical experience for people every day in their lives. I mean, with the magnificent storms that happen, the rains, the floods, and the warming up of the atmosphere, it's such an experiential thing that people think of it as a much more urgent crisis than the threat of nuclear war. The 2 things we think of actually in parallel, that they sort of feed one another. The spending of scientific, intellectual, as well as financial resources on nuclear weapons robs resources that are needed to confront climate change. The threatened use of nuclear weapons violates a number of treaties that have become customary, standard humanitarian international law. And we make the same case over and over again when we protest the deployment of these weapons, partly to see them removed, but at the same time to bring attention to them in the public mind. It seems to me the press pays absolutely no attention to nuclear weapons deployment unless a group of us is arrested at site by blocking the road or going in and inspecting these places. So civil disobedience is virtually forced on us by the inattention that's otherwise paid to these machines. So that's part of the reason, I suppose.
Nevertheless, the world was shaken by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident in Japan 10 years ago, with a gigantic tsunami completely flooding a nuclear reactor, and the aftermath of that remains horrific. Can you tell us something about that in your work involving analysis of the situation today, which would seem to be continuing?
Yes, you're right. The Fukushima catastrophe, which is ongoing because of the water crisis there, did wake up a lot of people, and it did change a lot of people's minds. Finally, it should be the final insult from nuclear power. Unfortunately, there's such a strong lobby which has so much financial clout in support of nuclear power that their con job, that it's an answer to climate change, does get through to a lot of people who pretend that it's not the same people who told us it would be so cheap it would be too cheap to meter the production of nuclear power. This industry has been successful in convincing a lot of people that low-dose radioactive contamination from these massive accidents can't be shown to harm people. And this is the trick that they have up their sleeve over and over again. The fact that human contamination by radioactive materials emitted by these catastrophes only results in effects that sometimes take years to show. The latency period, as it's called, between the time of your exposure and the evidence of any cancer or other illnesses is often 2 or 3, 4, sometimes 20 years. And for that reason, because bodies aren't laying in the street after a catastrophe like this, nuclear power proponents can get away with the claim that these accidents haven't killed anyone. On the other hand, because of Chernobyl and having contaminated Western Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, Germany, for example, after the Fukushima insult, decided to retire all 17 of its power reactors. And by the end of next year, it will have succeeded in replacing all that electric generation with wind turbines and solar photovoltaic systems. This is a major industrial country who has decided to retire all of its reactors. So it's a great example of what can be done if there's enough political will. And it did take this terrifying triple meltdown in Fukushima and its contamination encircling the Northern Hemisphere like like Chernobyl did, to move certain politicians. The current crisis there in Japan is sort of twofold. Greenpeace Japan published an excellent report in January or February of this year regarding its scientists and their study of residual contamination of northern Japan that's still found in the places that have supposedly been decontaminated. And so their report was a warning to Japan to postpone or cancel the Olympic Games that are scheduled to begin soon because of contamination or decontamination efforts in Japan that have failed miserably. The other crisis there has to do with the 1.25 million metric tons of contaminated water that's been collected in giant steel tanks there. The government decided or announced that beginning in 2 years it will try to dilute some of this water and return it to the Pacific Ocean. This has raised an uproar in the Pacific region. Other Pacific countries would be open to the contamination that would spread from this return of the water.
Yeah, it's not as if the Pacific belongs to Japan, is it?
Yeah, that's in fact what the Chinese foreign minister said right away in response to their announcement. He said that the Pacific Ocean is not Japan's trash can. There are alternatives to the dumping of this water, and those are outlined very well in the Greenpeace report from February. And of course, they're more expensive systems or alternatives, but they don't put at risk the entire Pacific Ocean. The other problem with releasing this material is that the filtering system that was invented whole cloth, it was never known before this catastrophe began in 2011. The Japanese invented a water filtration system to try to remove some of the radionuclides from this cooling water, and it has failed miserably. The company itself admitted in September last year that over 70% of its retained water in these tanks is still contaminated with cesium, strontium, even plutonium, neptunium, americium, really exotic reactor-based radioisotopes that were supposed to have been filtered out. So the company claims that it will refilter this stored water before any attempt to pour it back into the ocean. This, of course, is the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is notorious for scandalous lies and cover-ups of its accidents, and virtually nothing it says to the public is to be believed. It has to be scrutinized by independent analysts and commissions. In fact, the entire operation of this cleanup project there should be taken over by an independent commission, and TEPCO should be forbidden from participating in it anymore after its history of scandals.
Well, what about the pelagic fish? Because they travel vast distances, and I know that there's been contamination found in seafood along the west coast of America, and also as far south as Australia.
Yeah, that's right. The findings were rather quick because tuna travel, the large bluefin tuna and others can travel really, really fast across the ocean. And they were found to be contaminated 4 months after the accident started back in 2011 on the California coast. And it's one thing about cesium-137, one of the major contaminants that's being spewed by this disaster in Japan. You can trace it and identify it real easily because of its fingerprint, you could say. And the ongoing, relentless, perpetual release of radioactive materials from the reactors there and the filtering system means that the ocean is going to continue to be contaminated with these materials, and has been now for these 11 years. And the problem with these materials is that they're persistent in the environment, and they work their way up the seafood chain or the food web and they bioconcentrate as they move up the food chain. The concentration of these materials increases as the fish or the seafood animals get larger. So by the time it's in a tuna, which survives on smaller fish, the concentration is dangerous. Another problem we have, of course, is confronting the industrial and the government's claims that a certain amount of cesium per cubic liter is going to be harmless, or even they might say safe. And these claims are outrageous, because most of the scientific analysis admits that any exposure to radioactive materials carries with it a risk of harm to the health, any amount whatsoever, no matter how small. So when governments establish a limit of cesium in the amount of fish you eat, or some volume of fish you eat, it's always an insult to the intelligence, because the same governments admit that there is no safe amount of exposure.
Couldn't we have expected a more outraged reaction from the international health authorities? Where are they when their citizens are eating potentially contaminated seafood?
That's a great question, because this goes back to earlier, you mentioned the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and some of their sister organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility, which has chapters all over the world. They've been excellent in trying to rebut official papers or presentations by the United Nations Committee on Radiation Exposure. It's called UNSCAR, the United Nations, I'm missing the acronym right now, Scientific Committee on Atomic Radiation. They've issued a paper about Fukushima. It's probably 5 or 6 years old now. And that's a United Nations organization, part of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it came out and whitewashed the potential harm from Fukushima's releases of radioactive materials. And the International Physicians Group wrote an excellent rebuttal, point by point, finding fault with this whitewash. Again, it's not something that people are familiar with. The newspapers, generally speaking, the commercial newspapers will report on the UN's report from UNSCAR, but not follow up and report on the rebuttal from the doctors and the scientists, unfortunately.
Yeah. And also, the world seems to have lost consciousness of the link between production of nuclear power and production of nuclear weapons.
Yes, that's been a phenomenon ever since the Eisenhower era, when he invented this phrase called atoms for peace, that some of your older listeners will remember was a way to give the world the impression that nuclear power isn't just for mass destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, but can be used to produce civilian electricity. So at that time, the industry invented a wall of separation, pretending that there was no connection between nuclear power generation and the development of nuclear weapons. Of course, the U.S. is in Israel's position that Iran can't make any enriched uranium without producing nuclear weapons is a direct contradiction to that position. Of course, you do have to increase the level of uranium-235, that's called enrichment, from the amount that's in uranium ore in order to use it for fuel in a reactor. And the enrichment process is a necessary step in producing nuclear power. It's also a step in the direction of nuclear weapons, but you have to have a nuclear reactor first, producing nuclear electricity and burning up the uranium fuel before you can then remove these used fuel rods, uranium fuel rods, and then reprocess the bombarded fuel rods in order to extract the plutonium to make nuclear weapons. So it's a very complicated process, and they are directly related. Another element in the production of nuclear weapons is called tritium, the radioactive form of hydrogen, which is also produced in great quantities in nuclear reactors. And tritium, in fact, is the gas that makes a regular atomic bomb into a hydrogen bomb, this radioactive form of hydrogen. And it used to be that the U.S. military, or the Department of Energy's military wing, produced its tritium for the bomb at Savannah River and Hanford, Washington, separately from the civilian nuclear power system. But in the 1980s, they openly moved to start producing tritium at civilian reactors, power reactors, because of their need to close down the dirty, dangerous production reactors that were being used for military purposes in Washington and Savannah River. So the mythology came crashing down then, and the government openly was making bomb material at civilian plants. This, of course, goes on in other countries as well.
Should we be seeing something ominous in Japan's extraordinary amount of storage of spent plutonium?
Well, just environmentally, it's quite ominous, because this stuff needs to be kept out of the water table for the rest of time. It even needs to be kept out of exposure to the atmosphere, because plutonium is pyrophoric, which is a bizarre sort of phenomenon, a material that ignites into flames when it's exposed to the air. So this material is so dangerous and deadly that it needs to be containerized for the rest of time. So I think of it more as an environmental problem than a military one. It's a dirty bomb waiting to go off, and the Japanese aren't the only ones who have the dilemma. The U.S. alone has something over 40 tons of plutonium oxide left in various places, stored all over the country, and needs to containerize that for the rest of time. All these things are dreadful environmental expenses that need to be paid a lot of attention to, and at great expense, in order to protect the water and the long-term health of the species.
This brings us back, I guess, to COVID, because absenteeism is one of the byproducts of the pandemic, where people are too ill to attend workplaces in essential industries. Redundancy is very low in the nuclear power industry, and we've got, 450 reactors worldwide. Isn't there a great danger that skilled technicians won't be on hand in sufficient numbers to maintain safely some nuclear reactors?
Yes, that's a very real problem. I was just reading last week, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the agency in the U.S. that monitors and regulates power reactors here. And because of the absenteeism caused by the pandemic, the NRC inspector fleet, the group of reactor inspectors that are supposed to keep tabs on the operating efficiency and safety of operating units, cut back on the severity and the regularity of their inspections. They cut back severely on the frequency of their inspections, and I don't know from the documents right now if their schedules return to normal. But that doesn't bode well for some of these reactors in the United States, which are over 40 years old. Some are 50 years old. Most recently, the phenomenon being opposed by nuclear critics across the country is the extending of the operational life licenses of these units, which were built to last 40 years and then be turned off. Just speaking yesterday with the people at Beyond Nuclear in Washington, D.C., Paul Gunter is a reactor specialist there, and he points out that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has granted each and every single license extension application that it's ever gotten from the industry 93 times. Reactor operators asked to operate their reactors past the 40-year license, operate them for 60 years. Most recently, they're asking to operate reactors for 80 years, and the NRC is issuing a rubber stamp approval in each and every case. So this, combined with cutting back on operating inspections, safety inspections, does raise alarms all across the country about potential for severe accidents.
Nuclear reactors generally are less safe than they were in earlier times then, with this acceptance of overaged reactors.
Yes, exactly. As these units age, as the reactor gets 40, 45, 48 years old, one reactor 2 hours to the west of our offices here in Wisconsin, it's at Monticello, Minnesota. It's 48 years old. It's also a General Electric model identical to the three that melted down in Japan, a General Electric pressurized water reactor. So these aging units start to rattle enough to become more and more dangerous every year. The incidence of severe accidents at reactors are typically in the early years when they're starting up and everything's green and untested, and subsequently in later years when the machines have been running for many, many decades and the material, especially inside the core, has become embrittled. The word is embrittled because of neutron bombardment of the so-called cladding that holds the nuclear fuel pellets together. The zirconium cladding is bombarded with neutrons for all these many, many years, becomes embrittled and subject to cracks and leaks. And that's when problems become extremely severe, and potential for meltdowns happen because of extraordinary heat running out of control.
Well, it sounds like at your Nukewatch offices you have balcony seat for a very dodgy reactor. Have you thought of relocating?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. maybe southern hemisphere where there's fewer reactors would be safer.
John LaForge, it's been great talking with you and to have your insights on the Political Compass podcasts. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.